Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our National Security Briefing webinar. This is the third in a series, and we're excited to have you here. As many of you know, we are doing a round two with Vint Cerf and with Joshua Marcuse, and they will be live and speaking with us in just a second. I'm going to go over a quick series of notes on the ground rules as well. First, thank you to Leidos for making this possible by supporting the webinar series. We appreciate you very much, and particularly Bill Bender, who's on our board of directors, who's facilitated all this. Thank you. We will be asking the questions only in the chat function. I will take questions from there and questions that were asked when you registered and share those with Vint and Josh. And I will also be adding my own questions based on their remarks and what they have to say. This webinar is being recorded. It will be available to you to listen to in the future, as the first one is on our website, and I would encourage you to take a listen. They are very interesting folks, and the first webinar was fantastic. So hopefully the second webinar will live up to the first, and I expect that it will based on my conversations with Vint and Josh over the last week. With that, I'm going to turn over to Admiral Fritz Rogi. He is the 16th president of the National Defense University for his welcome remarks. Admiral Rogi, thank you.
Okay, well, and James, thank you for that kind introduction. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining today's webinar. And of course, especially thank our special guests, Vint Cerf and Josh Marcuse, for joining us again to share their time and their insights. And of course, I want to thank the National Defense University Foundation for hosting today's national security discussion. The NDU Foundation is one of the most important partners of the National Defense University, but in reality, everyone listening today is one of our partners because of our shared interest in the security of our nation. So just a brief word about the importance of your National Defense University. National security is our mission. We educate rising professionals to become the senior leaders across military, government, and industry that our nation will depend upon tomorrow. And I'm certain that this crowd appreciates that we live in an increasingly complex, dynamic, and uncertain world. We face many competitors and threats to our security. And to counter these threats, America requires leaders who can outthink our adversaries. Because the technological superiority that we have long enjoyed is important, but it is insufficient to deliver the warfighting advantage that our nation's security demands and that our service members deserve. In fact, competitors are investing heavily to try to erode our technical advantages, and so it's imperative that we also create intellectual advantage. And that's our job here at NDU. We try and develop the critical thinkers, the joint warfighters, and the strategic leaders who provide the U.S. and our allies with the intellectual overmatch required to prevail against the threats of today and of tomorrow. Our students are in equal parts military members of the U.S. Armed Services, civilians from U.S. government departments and agencies, and this year 120 international students from 75 friendly partner and allied nations. And if we do well at our education mission, then they will graduate with the ability to launch the kind of ideas that could preclude the need to launch weapons. And that is a positive effect that reaches far beyond the classroom and beyond graduation day, because the ways in which the U.S. and its partners work together on common security challenges are ways that are increasingly joint and interagency and international. And that means that the relationships that are built in our classrooms translate directly into the relationships that serve our common security interests. And so the lasting measure of our success is in the peace and security enjoyed by the United States and our friends. In the words of former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan, education is, quite simply, peace building by another name. It is the most effective form of defense spending there is. So let me then suggest that if you would want the leaders of your national security enterprise, the key decision makers contributing to your peace and security, if you would want them to be well educated in how to do so, then you should not only be partners of NDU, but our advocates. And I hope that will encourage you all to learn more about the Chairman's University, your National Defense University. So thanks again for joining us. And with that, I'd like to now turn over the microphone to Vint Cerf and Josh Marcuse. Gentlemen.
Thank you. Sorry, it took me a moment to get my camera going here. Thank you very much, Admiral. And nice to see Josh and James again. They're calling this round 2, although Josh and I never felt like this was a sparring contest necessarily. If anything, it's an opportunity to explore ideas, and thanks to those of you who are listening and who participated in the last discussion, we have a huge collection of questions which we will probably not succeed in getting all the way through. There must be at least 50 of them here. And each of them probably deserves at least half an hour's worth of discussion. Josh, do you have the questions in front of you as well by any chance? If not,
I do. Although I'm very happy to let you guide the pace at which we tackle them in the order, but they're in front.
Let's make this a shared expedition. I'll be honest, I have not tried to order them. I read through them. But I haven't had a chance to really put them in any particular order.
Well, I certainly have some questions for you both, and in a particular order. But I'd be glad to take any of yours that you'd like to answer first. Otherwise, I'd be glad to start asking questions.
Well, James, if you actually have an order that you would prefer, then let's follow your advice, because at least I'm not in a position to have ordered them well. And Josh, up to you whether you accept James' offer.
I definitely defer to James. I think we'll let him earn his salary today and guide this conversation in the most productive direction.
And
well,
of course,
I think I earned my salary when I got both of you to say yes, so thank you.
Well, on the other hand, James, if we don't like the questions you're asking, we have the whole list here in front of us, and we'll just go someplace else. So, so you're at risk. Go for it.
I am absolutely at risk, but I'm going to start with one that I think is a wide-ranging one and where we were a little bit at towards the end of the discussion last time. And that's actually the 4th question on the list, but it's how do we shape and influence the military, industrial, and congressional complex for the world today instead of yesterday? And I think that really got to a lot of what you guys were talking about last time, is how do we influence the thinking so that we get where we need to go and have the outcomes that we need? It's a complex world.
So let me remind everybody that I don't remember to whom to attribute the quote, but the idea was diplomacy was the art of the possible. And in some sense, it's not just diplomacy, it's all the things that we do is about what's possible. And what we often don't know is what is possible. We don't even allow our imaginations to explore. In fact, some people will describe bad outcomes as a failure of imagination. A good example of that was the 9/11 event. Some people actually considered the possibility of using airplanes to crash into buildings, and everybody said nobody would ever do that. And of course, not too many years later, somebody did. So my first thought on this one is to not allow past history to be the sole guide of what we develop in terms of our capabilities. The Advanced Research Projects Agency is a place where high-risk ideas are explored, and they certainly don't have a monopoly on good ideas, nor the monopoly on the ability to pursue them. But the attitude there is to take on high-risk kinds of challenges to see whether it's possible to do something with them. The traditional way of procuring weapon systems involves a very long requirements evaluation process, followed by a specification process, followed by tenders and evaluations and the like. And the problem I see with that process is that it looks backwards rather than forwards enough. We fight the last battle, we prepare weapon systems to do better in the previous battle, not the ones that might come in the future. And so I think exploration of possibilities, prototypes and things of that kind seem to me very important. And we don't invest enough in prototyping, in allowing fly-offs, for example, where multiple parties get to push things to at least some level of functionality before we come to any conclusions. So that would be my first guess, is that we should shift the procurement process to one which is more exploratory. Our financial structure in the DoD incorporates that. We have 6.1 and 6.2, 6.3, 6.4, 6.5 money. And 6.1 is research and 6.2 is sort of the exploratory applied research. It could be that we should emphasize that more. But Josh, you've been in this game for a bit. is this overly simplistic, or do we actually have room for expanding our capacity to try things out, even if we're not 100% sure they're going to work?
It's interesting, all the things that are old are new again. I mean, I think we are very often today reflecting on an earlier era, characterized, I think, by Skunk Works in its early days, where we were able to get a faster iteration rate and cycle time in hardware production, and even new airframes every year was sort of the peak of what I think is now once again called prototype warfare. And the ability to compete at iteration cycles in a kind of almost like a technological OODA loop. And I think the difficulty that we have is that we were able to be that productive at that fast iteration rate as we had optimized for hardware. And so the problem is that over time, as we became greater and greater software complexity, we were introducing more and more risk, and in order to balance that risk, creating more and more stability, and found ourselves in a sort of a trap where we were applying waterfall development methodology that worked well for hardware and applying it to software in an acquisition system that was perfectly optimized to win the Cold War and perfectly sub-optimized for this new world. And so what I think we're living through right now, which is I think what Vint was describing, is an adjustment of our philosophy and our practice on acquisition to a world in which fast iteration is now ubiquitous in the commercial world and sadly absent from our defense world. And so that, I think, is really the question, which is how do we get back to this rich heritage that we had at rapid iteration, but do it in a new and modern way, reflecting the reality of the future capabilities are software defined now, hardware enabled, but software defined. And so we know how to do that fast iteration, but we have to sort of relearn it for a new era. And what it really comes down to is a fundamental shift in risk accounting, or how we think about risk. And so in a very sort of deterministic physics-based world, we thought about risk very much in terms of does the vehicle have the properties that we expect, size, weight, performance? And now it's really a very different kind of risk. And we're very comfortable with the rhetoric around embracing risk and failing fast and iteration and all the things that we've imported culturally from startups, but it's very superficial. And I think the challenge to the defense industrial congressional complex that the questioner asked is, how do we retrain our mindset around the risk of not iterating fast enough, as opposed to the risk that any one given iteration might fail? And if you look at the way Congress has optimized their oversight, which is absolutely their constitutional right, obligation, and an essential function in our democracy, particularly in an era of declining defense budgets, if they are using risk criteria about avoiding the kinds of failures that appeared to be catastrophic in the past, and not embracing a new risk criteria about the failure to advance at a faster pace of acceleration, then they will continue to beat the department up every time the department attempts to move into this more software-defined future, because they're applying this hardware metric. And that, I think, has really been the struggle you've seen over the last 7 years. New organizations in the department that are trying to engage in this sort of prototype competition, being held to standards of accountability that really made a great deal of sense when you're doing 15-year acquisition cycles of really hardware-defined things. So to bridge the question about what does the defense industrial complex look like and what does the congressional complex look like, you need a grand bargain. And the grand bargain is this: the department needs to trade flexibility in spending with an unprecedented degree of transparency with Congress. Congress is right not to just trust the department, but Congress isn't going to get the outcomes they want from the department if they don't give them flexibility. But the appropriators are never going to give colorless, yearless, carte blanche money to the department, and the department doesn't deserve it, honestly. So the bargain has to be, we will give you more flexibility, but you will give us more transparency. And the irony is, and this is a delicious irony, is that software enables you to do it. I mean, you could imagine dashboards that give you real-time metrics on the performance of every dollar that the congressional oversight could log into at the same time as the program manager could log into, and we could all operate over one same dashboard with all the same data in it, updated to the second. But neither the department nor Congress is culturally ready for that degree of transparency. So it is a big psychological shift about your attitude towards risk that gets us out of the loop we're caught in and into a new and more virtuous loop.
So that's really quite a powerful formula. One thing I would observe is that a lot of what you said, Josh, feels like it is aimed at weapons systems, for example. And I'm going to make the argument that the Defense Department does best when it doesn't have to fight. It does best when it has figured out how to avoid that. That sometimes means a collaboration, for example, with the intelligence community, with the State Department. It is, it's certainly desirable to end up in a situation where nobody wants to fight us because they know they'll lose. And for that, you need to have credible military capacity. But I think it's also very important for us to invest in technologies that help us avoid having that battle at all. That suggests to me a couple of things. The first one is that information is key, and that our ability to process it is extremely important, and our ability to process it at scale is equally, if not more important. And that's something that we've learned at Google, which is figuring out how to take vast quantities of information, make it discoverable, searchable, relevant, and useful. Which is sort of our whole mantra: organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. We would like that to be true for the Defense Department as well. So, and how to put that that information to work in order to inhibit the likelihood of conflict seems to me another big plus. Much of what you mentioned with regard to software, of course, makes me think of the Teslas that we have. And I think this came up in the last conversation, where you get in the car and it says, guess what I can do today, what I couldn't do yesterday. Of course, I always worry that it still does what it was supposed to do before, in addition to the new thing, because I'm depending on that. There is also an issue about the lifetime of the apparatus that lets us build these systems. The hardware is hard to replace, and so the flexibility of software-enabled systems is very attractive, but it's also scary as hell, because we know that software is complicated, we know we make mistakes, we know there are emergent properties that come out that have behaviors that we hadn't expected, especially true in machine learning, where we know it breaks from time to time. And so the heavy emphasis on artificial intelligence that I hear more and more often today in the context of the Defense Department raises some worries on my part about overdependence on some of these systems without recognizing their brittleness. So James, we should probably, well, let's let Josh react, and then we should probably pick another question.
No, I have nothing further to add to that, other than to say that I completely agree with you, Vint. It doesn't have to be for weapon systems. I think the same property of making short-term thinking about investing in solutions exists in the defense reform world every much as the weapon systems world. So if you think about all of the challenges that we have on trying to drive reform into the world's largest organization, and all of the angst over what the right organizational model is, a lot of these things could be solved by bringing agile software development to the process of reforming the department's internal operations. But since it's very difficult to request funding for 5 years for a program that does that, we end up having the department often ask for massive ERP systems, making huge claims about giant savings and trying to plan things out are very complex, and they end up managing their data poorly, in the same way that we would manage the build of a submarine poorly. And so it's kind of the same answer, and it doesn't really matter whether it's a weapon system or anything else. It really has to do with competency in the ability to treat data as a strategic asset, the ability to store that data in a commercial cloud that makes it affordable to own and accessible to use, and then having people that are trained and rewarded and encouraged to create applications on that data in the cloud in a modern development environment so they can give commanders and decision makers useful information and get it to do what they want it to do. And that is very true for everything from, you know, getting childcare to services at bases to maintaining buildings and maintenance. It's true for healthcare and all of these things that are common to many organizations that have nothing to do with the warfighting missions of the department and everything to do with trying to embrace a culture that is, you know, essentially digitally native. And it's very difficult to drive that when you don't have a budgeting system and a planning system that is tooled for that rapid iteration.
So
if it takes 2 years to write the requirement and another year to get it funded, and you're planning for things you want to do 3 years in advance, you'll never be on the commercial curve. As long as it takes that long, we'll never get there. So the PPBE system, which has survived nearly intact since the McNamara era, is simply not tooled for the pace at which we want change. So if Congress wants DoD to be faster, more agile, more responsive, they have to fund it in a way that is fundamentally different from the PPBE system that they've always had. That is a circle that will never close.
So this is interesting because James, you could ask one question and we could go off for an hour on it.
Right.
I actually want to reinforce something that Josh said about transparency and also understanding what is going on. You know, how is our operation doing? And I use the term operation deliberately here because it's applicable to warfighting situations and running the Defense Department in all of its complexity. Our ability to understand what's going on is a force multiplier. Our ability to execute logistics is a force multiplier. And so what we need and don't necessarily have is automated transparency, data that we can use to understand how well or how poorly we are operating. That's true for businesses as well as the Defense Department, which is simply one gigantic business. So I think we could learn from the private sector ways in which we can understand how well or how poorly we are doing. And I really like and want to endorse what Josh is saying about transparency. It is the ultimate in accountability. And if we're willing to discipline ourselves based on what that transparency is telling us, and if we're given credit for recognizing when we are going, you know, the wrong way and have fixed it, then that flexibility should be to our advantage.
So I want to ask the next question that's a little bit of a blend of two. One is around the transparency and how government gains industry and public trust in the work that it's doing. And the other is the impact of data on logistics, global distribution, deployment, and interface with the commercial sector. And I want to use two examples of that related to the commercial sector. One is SpaceX, and we could use any of their other competitors as well. But the development of a commercial technology that's now being employed by the Department of Defense and NASA and others to meet government requirements. That was not spec'd exactly in the same procurement process. And the other is these small low Earth orbit CubeSats that are being used from everything from the geo stationary web access to the satellite photography that can be positioned anywhere very, very quickly and respond. And again, these are responding to what are commercial needs, and yet they're doing the same sorts of things that military and DoD satellites and things have done. They're all generating tremendous amounts of data, and that data all has application in the defense sector and capability that we don't have in the government sector. How do we pull all those things together?
Well, first of all, this is very much in the theme of open source, for example, open access to information that everybody has access to, and then learning to process it better than everybody else. Gosh, you put so many different pieces into that one. Let me give you an example. There's a NASA satellite called ICESat-2 And I recently having a discussion with the National Geointelligence Agency about their use of ICESat-2 in order to analyze the topography of the coastal areas, because they have LIDAR, ocean penetrating LIDAR, which is good enough to analyze what the topographies are down to about 30 meters or so. And what was cool about it is that they were taking data that was intended for a different purpose, the thickness of the ice and how quickly things are melting, in order to analyze it for another purpose. Again, back to Josh's point about being able to gather data and do something useful with it, even something innovative with it that we hadn't thought of before. The interesting thing about CubeSats versus gigantic large-scale satellites partly has to do with our ability to pack a lot of processing in a small amount of space. Our Moore's law has really transformed the equation. A small satellite, CubeSat, for example, can have enough processing power in it so that it can do what we would not have done except with a much larger, physically heavier piece of equipment. So now we can put lots more of those things up there. They're lighter, we can put them up faster, we can put them, repeatedly launch them. They're in low Earth orbit, which means that, they have better visibility because the distance is much smaller, dramatically smaller. And it's easier to replenish them. We can steer them around. It's just an amazingly flexible environment. I do worry a little bit about everything running into everything else, though. We have the problem of a cloud of stuff, debris and all the other things that we should be worried about. So I don't want to minimize the side effects of moving in that direction. But the ability to use processing power to harness collections of satellites where they work together, they collaborate together in order to do what a single, much heavier and more expensive piece of equipment had to do is extremely attractive. And of course, it doesn't hurt at all that the private sector has figured out how to get stuff into orbit at less cost than we experienced before, thanks to reusable boosters and things of that kind. So we are really in a different era, and I think that the Defense Department should correctly recognize that the private sector is now capable of doing things that only the government could do before. And it's now time for us to take advantage of that. We are going to have to persuade the private sector that the Defense Department is capable of changing its mindset in order to work with the other than the traditional defense industrial base in order to take advantage of the kind of creativity that we're seeing emerging out of startups and out of non-traditional dual use kinds of products. Josh?
Hard to add much to that, but I would say that I think the broader question that you raised, James, and then been articulated so clearly about observation of the Earth from space in new types of platforms, new types of satellites that have very different properties and very different economics than the satellites that were built by the government, is two important trends. One, the first trend is to appreciate that we now are living with two different systems for technology development that coexist. One system in which there are things that you really only want and expect governments to build, where the research and development to build those things that are really uniquely the provenance of governments is still funded and prosecuted and advanced in the way that it always has been. Everyone's favorite example of this is hypersonics, for which there's very little commercial application. And now that has to live and frankly thrive and coexist with a second system where it is actually the commercial world that is developing technologies more rapidly than the governments are. And so there is a passing of the baton where the government is the leader in some areas and the follower in others. And I think I give great credit to the National Defense Strategy, which coined the term fast follower and appreciated that we now are in two different competitive dynamics. A competitive dynamic where we are competing against other nation states for things like hypersonics, quantum supremacy, and other things that really are of interest to nation states. And now we're also competing at the same time for the rapid adoption of commercial capability. And my concern is that we're not very good at optimizing for both. And so we could find ourselves in the situation where other countries adopt commercial technology faster than ours. And I saw a headline last week that really concerned me, which was that Turkey has apparently developed more sophisticated drone swarming technology than we would be deploying anytime soon because of all the appropriate safeguards that the United States have. And I think we need to be extremely cautious about that. But we might see countries adopting different forms of technology that were essentially born in the commercial world and then applied to a military context or militarized, if you will, and do it in a way that's very different than the way we will. So this notion of fast followership becomes pretty fundamental to understanding how to adapt or spin in these new technologies. And I think that idea is fairly well understood. So I won't go into any deeper than that, but you really shouldn't underestimate its impact on what we spend our money on, how we spend it, and at what rate, and what our competitors are doing. The second trend, which I think is much more alarming, is we really see going on is a diffusion of commercial technology that has military strategic implications and a democratization of capability that will enable a lot of people to do things that we would prefer fewer countries have the ability to do. And so if you think about what it cost the United States and the Soviet Union to manage an intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance complex, it was billions. And now, when there are many different ways to just purchase incredibly detailed satellite imagery with a very high revisit rate, and to use hobbyist drones to be able to provide that, you now have, ISR of very high quality available to non-state actors, as well as other countries. And you see the same thing with artificial intelligence, where as the field progresses, just throwing enough money at a problem, buying more compute, can actually give countries that don't have the technical acumen of the engineers or the sophistication of the algorithms the ability to solve problems with deep learning that it used to be only an incredibly sophisticated coder would be able to do. And so there is a different dynamic, and I'd love Vint to respond to this. There is a different dynamic unfolding as these technologies become democratized, and we may not be as adept at adapting them to our purposes as competitors do, and that can really change the dynamic in ways I'm not sure we've prepared for or foreseen.
So there's an interesting tension here that I would draw attention to. We have things like ITAR and other kinds of constraints on the escape of certain technologies that we worry about. And yet, given the thesis that Josh puts in place, a lot of those technologies are going to get out there regardless of whether ours leaves the borders or not. And so rather than trying to stop things from happening, maybe the right answer is run faster, explore faster, develop faster, a theme that we've already visited. Now, I do have a question about supply chain issues, because dependencies now become a very critical part of your ability to sustain an operation, to sustain your capacity to act at need. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated an example of a very serious supply chain deficiency that has impeded our ability to respond well. I mean, setting aside some leadership issues as well, but the key question about where does the equipment come from, and the answer turns out to be China in many cases. Where does the pharmacological stuff come from? The answer turns out to be China. Is that what we want to depend on? And the answer is probably not. So the same could be said for a number of defense relevant technologies. We want to make sure that we have the capacity to build those supply chains in a controllable way. I do have a question though, Josh, and for James too. There are some other countries that have remarkable capabilities. I think of the Israelis and the Iron Dome system, about which I know only a little, but my impressions are that it works quite well for the situation that they're in. Do we ever ingest anybody else's technology, like the Israeli technologies? And if we do, maybe that's a good thing.
Well, from my perspective, the answer to that is yes, absolutely. We do ingest those. One of the companies that we worked with on a lecture in January with the former Secretary of the Air Force talked about that very readily, because it was about how do we adopt the commercial technologies of Israel, and they were a subsidiary of an Israeli defense firm. And so that was an interesting aspect of that. And I think we do those things in some of our programs, the F-35 program, for instance, where we have outsourced different types of the technological build to different countries, and then we're seeing the interruption of that due to political fallout, as well as things like COVID and others. So there's definitely that aspect of it. And then the other question that I think is really important here is how are we able to garner that information about where they're ahead of us in the same way that we've had to deal with them doing that to us. Now, we're seeing some restrictions on academic visas coming in. We don't happen to send most of our students overseas to study those engineering technologies, but we certainly are looking at how other people are engineering these and doing the same. So I think that goes to the data theft component of it. I think it goes to export controls and ITAR, as you talked about earlier. And there are a whole host of those things that are two-way or more streets and go to, I think, treaties. I think they go to multinational trade agreements and other things as well. Josh?
I would say I'm so glad you asked that question, because I think it points to the other virtuous side of this democratization and the advance of the significance of these digital technologies, because in the same way that it can spell deeper competition in some areas, it also opens up whole new possibilities for collaboration with partners. And so if you look at the alliance, NATO, with its dozens of member states, all with very different levels of defense spending and very different capabilities, it's actually really inspiring to think about even a small country like Estonia that has developed exceptional cybersecurity capabilities can really be an incredibly important partner to a country like the United States, which spends much more on defense. And so if what you're sharing is data, labeled data, algorithms, software, it really levels the playing field and allows an intellectual contribution that can have a huge impact from partners of all different shapes and sizes. And so I think about what is the future of the alliance system is really much more about data alliances, information sharing alliances, the ability to cooperate on a common cloud infrastructure for sharing information. It's almost a sort of virtual cyber and software alliance, very much more so than what we might have thought historically as being purely basing rights or contributing peacekeepers to a mission. And that, I think, is actually a really uplifting possibility for what it might look like for democracies to collaborate together according to shared norms.
So this raises a very important point, Josh, and that is the essence of alliance and the importance of maintaining that alliance. These relationships, if we allow them to proceed in the way that you're urging, then we need to be assured that those alliances can persist, because if they fall apart for some reason, then the dependencies then become liabilities. And so I can't imagine anything more important than assuring that our various democratic alliances are maintained in a robust way. And I think the last few years have taught us some lessons about that. And so the importance of maintaining the relationships affects our ability to defend and the technologies that we use to do that. And I hope that people who make the important decisions recognize this connection between the relationships and the technologies of defense that we will collectively be relying upon.
There's a question from the audience that's interested in the ethical use of technology, and specifically talking about commercial entities employing, quote, better ethics than if technologies were confined to the government. And of course, the example being used is facial recognition. Any comments on those things and related to the employment of technology and the ethical and moral use of technology?
So two questions. The first, or immediate thoughts. The first one is that the facial recognition systems that I know about are not very reliable. And the consequence of this is that it is unethical, in my opinion, to put those to work in a way which does not also take into account the unreliability and uncertainty of those systems. I think there have been any number of examples of, I think they took, I seem to recall, this is maybe an urban rumor, but somebody took the faces of the members of the House of Representatives or maybe one of the state legislatures and ran them through the system and identified some significant fraction as known criminals. And not because of their legislative misbehavior, but because of mistaken identity. And the point here is that it is a failure of ethical quality to imply that we should use technologies that are of uncertain capability. And we need to teach people who develop those things to keep in mind and to think about and to warn us about the brittleness of those technologies. So in terms of facial recognition, it can be helpful as a clue, but it's only a clue, and it should not be trusted to make decisions. That's true generally of a lot of software, whether it's artificial intelligence or not. Turning over authority to a piece of software to take action without your intervention should be done only with great caution and great care, because otherwise there are catastrophic consequences. So think about medical instruments that have computers in between, like the robotic surgical systems. You can imagine that the software and hardware associated with that get extreme testing for all kinds, or should anyway, get extreme testing. So Josh was nodding his head, so you must have a common view on this.
Yes, I have nothing further to add. I think that's exactly right.
So since you mentioned AI,
James, so now, Josh, we do have a problem, and that is, how do we teach people who create these technologies to understand their ethical implications? How do we teach them even to understand and evaluate the quality of the technology with regard to its potential abuse? How do we detect that it's being abused? We're back to your transparency point, which could not be overemphasized in my view. Understanding what's going on requires transparency and visibility. So perhaps, maybe there's a registration process of some kind. We have a fairly elaborate process inside of Google to look at artificial intelligence, for example, and evaluate it and the application for which it is intended before we actually execute. And I would like to see that happen more regularly.
I think that's right. And the department has undertaken its own review and process and has robust measures in place, which I think is essential and has really led the way for the whole world in the development of this. But what I think it really comes down to some degree is not just process or constraints to ensure misuse, but it also has to do with how we train engineers. And I think, there is really an enduring role for a liberal arts education, even amongst our technologists. And while it is absolutely accurate to point out the United States has huge deficits in STEM education and needs to overcome, we can't pursue those deficits at the expense of appreciating all of the empathy and compassion and ability to perceive nuance and complexity that comes from remembering the mission behind the technology and not falling in love with the technology itself. So I think, appreciating with humility the limits of our and constraints of that technology is really something that has to be instilled in the human beings. And what we found, which I think is really reassuring, is that the best AI systems come from these man-machine teaming units, where human beings and human intelligence is paired with artificial intelligence, and you have the benefits of human intuition and human judgment with the data processing ability and predictive ability of a highly technical machine. And I think if we adopt these technologies with the core belief that they are meant to augment human consciousness and extend human judgment to empower human beings to make better decisions with more information, then I think we may have the quality of intensifying the things that are virtuous about human judgment, and augmenting that with greater and greater machine intelligence. If we substitute humans with machines in areas about judgment as opposed to just process automation, then we may regret the outcomes that those systems arrive at. So how you adopt artificial intelligence, or just how you adopt good software, becomes pretty fundamental to your culture. And that's why we're going to see different countries with different cultures will use these technologies in different ways. That's why it's so important for the United States and its allies and other democracies to really think deeply about how to project our influence and advance the way our societies adopt these technologies and use them, because we have the ability to establish norms that will shape the trajectory of the investments we make and the applications of them. And those norms, I think, will be incredibly important for how our society turns out. And you don't need to look further than digital interference in an election to appreciate what happens when people abdicate responsibility for truly leading with these technologies. If you cede that territory to others, they'll do bad things with it. If we reclaim ownership of that for ourselves, then we can truly lead.
So there's an interesting issue here, and it has to do with where the human fits in the loop. There are certain cases like fire control where the human is incapable of being in that loop. The only place where the human can be is to decide whether it's a legitimate target, for example. And so we need to be thoughtful about how we address our obligations and our responsibilities, not just to ethics, but to literally responsibility for effective operation. So that we can include the human part of the equation in a way that works. Otherwise, we may find ourselves disabling the system and therefore not getting a force multiplier, but a force divider, which is not something that will serve us well at need. So figuring out where to place the human responsibility, I think, is part of the challenge.
I think that going along that line, there's also an interesting discussion to be had about what responsibility we have to understand how the use of these technologies are going to become common in other countries and other cultures and other values, because we may be in a place where we need to respond in a way that we can't respond based on our values to how someone else is going to use a technology. And perhaps that's something that we have to do, and that liberal arts education becomes very, very important. There is a question on the application of AI and choosing where to apply AI and machine learning and making those judgment calls along the lines that we're talking about. Is there a place for it instead of in combat systems to put it into the logistics and support? Are there other decisions that need to be made so that we can use it in its most efficient state, but not cede those value judgments to the AI?
Well, first of all, I think that our ability to assess the effectiveness of an AI-based tool is very important. We need to be able to measure how well these tools work and under what circumstances they don't work. And so finding the brittleness and fixing it is an important technical and research challenge, something that I repeatedly draw to the attention of the people at Google who work in this space. Because what we would like is to have practices that will expose weaknesses and find ways of fixing them, rather than being surprised at the moment when we don't want any surprise at all. So that's one, I think, very important research tool, research goal that we should emphasize. I'm sitting here thinking a little bit about. No, I'm sorry. I had a thought that ran away, and I won't waste your time on it. I'll holler if I think of it. Go ahead, Josh.
I mean, I know we promised round two, but I found myself constantly agreeing with Vint. I mean, the training and education, validation and verification of these tools is, and what people often explainable AI or other versions of trying to understand the properties behind these neural nets to understand why they're making the predictions they are. Is a vanguard field. But one concern that I do have is that we will forget how many different varieties of machine learning we are talking about when we lump everything together in AI. And they're all at different stages of maturity. and they can all be applied in different types of use cases. So I just want to be careful that we aren't a little too sweeping in our judgments about saying what is prudent and what is not, what is ethical and what is not. The reality is that there are automation processes that are able to translate documents, summarize statements, look at imagery, listen to audio, make predictions that humans cannot, which is really just either replacing human labor or enhancing human cognition or understanding. It's a perception. And that's very different from combining it with autonomy and giving it authority to operate in the physical world, with the unclear amount of specificity in the instructions given to the system, or certainly a non-deterministic system that is able to learn and adapt over time. So when we talk about these appropriate standards we have to set, we should be very careful that we are not accidentally creating a chilling effect on the adoption of technologies that are very mature and are really in wide use, and are in wide use in safety critical systems today, and can actually make us much safer and more humane. And so one of the responsibilities for the National Defense University is to educate our forces and our diplomats and our civilians to appreciate the distinctions between all these different types of systems, and knowing what is appropriate and what is safe, and what are the right ranges of acceptable behavior that we would expect. There are things that we expect from expert systems that we've relied on for decades that you could consider autonomy, or some might consider artificial intelligence, that has nothing to do with the experimental facial recognition software that Vint and I was talking about earlier, that are very brittle and prone to mistakes. And so you could do yourself a disservice if you lump all that together and call it AI. Some of it is just very good software.
So I finally remembered what it was, that the fleeting thought that fleeted. It was a Ditchley Foundation discussion that we had about the relationship between mutually assured destruction in the nuclear space, and what do we do about cyber warfare. And we concluded that there was no equivalent of mutually assured destruction in the cyberspace. We should not even contemplate such a concept because of the potential side effects of cyber attacks, especially against infrastructure writ large, so financial systems and electrical grids and all the other things. So it seems to me that we have uncharted territory right now as we move into increased dependence on cyber-based systems, to know how we should comport ourselves, knowing that those systems are potentially fragile and that we are heavily and increasingly dependent upon them. We in the US are more dependent than some of our adversaries are, although they are getting there. And in which case they may become somewhat more sympathetic to the idea that maybe allowing cyber warfare to occur unfettered is a bad idea. One hopes so, because we are quite vulnerable to those kinds of attacks. And we've seen the nature of the vulnerability is not simply the destruction of a particular computer-based system, but its influence on the way in which our society works or doesn't work or is in conflict. We've seen that, of course, in the past several years in the social media space. So I think that the Defense Department needs to invest in understanding the nature of cyberspace and the risk factors that are associated with it, in order to formulate policies that are not going to risk a simple-minded view of mutually assured destruction, which is absolutely not the right thing to do.
Well, as usual, our time has gone by very, very fast, and we have 2 minutes until we sign off. Any last words?
Well, from me, thank you for allowing us to blather on for another hour. This is helpful because it makes us think about problems that we might not otherwise think about. So I'm personally grateful for the time.
Gosh.
This last turn the conversation took made me think of a whole series of thesis papers that students at NDU could write about what the international law and treaties regimes should look like, not only for cyberspace, but also for artificial intelligence. We understand what these norms should look like at sea and in the air and in space, and I think we are struggling to figure out cyber deterrence for a number of years now, and the Solarium project worked on that. But it seems to me that the next frontier for a university that has students from around the world and diplomats would be to think through what would be the preferred set of institutions that we could draw up that we think would favor democracy and human rights. The greatest moment in the United States and world leadership was at the end of the Second World War, when we established the institutions that determined international diplomacy, international law, international economic institutions. And I think there's an opportunity for us to figure out what we think those institutions should be in the future.
It's timely that you should mention this, because on June 26th, we will celebrate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. It is the United Nations Charter Signing Day, and I have the great honor of speaking during that event, along with a number of others. And we will again celebrate the creation of and operation of the UN on September 21st, or that week this year. And so I would urge all of your students to be attentive to that, those milestone dates.
Well, it's certainly an area for exploration, and I think that we can bring together some folks from the State Department and other places to begin that dialogue in one of these webinars, and then present those as options that might be of interest to folks. I will let Admiral Rogie and his team make the assessment of where students might be able to best apply this, but I know that there are a lot of folks who are thinking about what their thesis will be in the coming year. So thank you, both of you, for joining us. I appreciate it very much. Thank you for the discussion. I think it was interesting for our students and the international actors who were here. We had a diverse audience, so I'm very excited to see that draw. Thank you again, and we will look forward to hosting you in person at NDU one of these days.
One of these days. Thank you for the opportunity.
Take care.